Nearly 1 year after that infamous Oscars slap, Chris Rock was on stage in Baltimore delivering his long-awaited response.
Oh, wow. Wow.
At 60, Chris Rock's laughter no longer hides the storm within. The man who made the world laugh has lived a life built on pain, loss, and secrets too heavy to share. Every joke was a cry for peace, every smile a shield against heartbreak. But behind the fame and applause lies a truth darker than anyone imagined. You would be surprised to know what really happened to the man who turned pain into laughter. From silence to laughter. Chris Rock was born on February 7, 1965, in Andrews, South Carolina. He was the eldest of 7 children in a family that carried both hope and hardship in equal measure. When he was still a baby, his parents, Julius and Rosalie Rock, packed their few belongings and left the red dust of South Carolina behind. They moved to Brooklyn, New York, searching for the promise of a better life, a promise that so often turned out to be nothing more than a dream for families like theirs. Their new home in Bedford-Stuyvesant was small and cold, its walls thin against the harsh Brooklyn winters. Julius worked endlessly, driving trucks by day and delivering newspapers before dawn, his hands stained with oil and fatigue. Rosalie worked just as hard, teaching preschool by morning and visiting struggling families as a social worker at night. Between the smell of metal and chalk, the Rock household was built on love, discipline, and survival. Outside, the streets were rough and opportunity was scarce. Poverty pressed in from every side, and even laughter felt borrowed. For young Chris, life changed dramatically when the city assigned him to a school far from his neighborhood as part of a desegregation program. The idea was equality, but what he found was cruelty. Each morning, he rode a yellow bus through neighborhoods where he was one of the only black children. The faces that met him there were not kind. They laughed, mocked, and sometimes hit him. He learned early that silence could protect him. He stopped telling his parents about the bruises and swallowed his pain. He walked fast, spoke little, and began to study people. Every insult, every stare became a lesson in rhythm and timing. It was here, in the middle of cruelty, that he began to understand the strange power of laughter. By the time he was a teenager, Chris had discovered that making others laugh gave him a kind of control, a small piece of power in a world that often made him feel invisible. He began to turn pain into humor, fear into performance. "I learned to laugh before I learned to breathe," he would later say, and those words captured everything about his youth. At 18, he started performing in small clubs, working odd jobs by day and chasing laughter by night. The audiences were small, the pay smaller, but the stage gave him something life never had before: a voice. But laughter born from pain rarely comes without a cost, and for young Chris Rock, the price of chasing his dream would soon test his strength like never before. Rise through rejection. After years of hardship, Chris Rock stepped into adulthood with nothing but his determination and a dream that often felt too far away. He worked long hours at low-paying jobs, sweeping floors, and flipping burgers just to survive. By night, he chased the sound of laughter in small, smoky clubs where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. The rooms were small, the crowds unpredictable, and the pay barely enough for a meal. He performed in basements, dive bars, and anywhere someone would hand him a microphone. The humiliation was real, but so was the hunger to be heard. Every rejection became fuel. Every failed performance taught him something new about timing, tone, and truth. He was broke, lonely, and invisible to the world, but he had a fire that refused to go out. Then, one night in 1986, everything changed. Eddie Murphy, already a superstar, walked into a comedy club and watched the skinny young comic on stage. Chris's jokes were rough, but there was something raw and real in his voice. Murphy saw potential where others saw only nerves. A few weeks later, he offered Chris a small part in Beverly Hills Cop 2. The role was short, the paycheck modest, but for Chris, it was a door opening to a world he had only dreamed about. That opportunity led him to bigger stages and new chances, but fame never came easily. In 1990, he joined Saturday Night Live, one of the most famous comedy shows in the world. The pressure was suffocating. The studio lights were blinding, the competition fierce. Every week felt like a battle to prove himself. Some nights, the laughter roared.
I have not been back to 48 I am never going in the Freedom Tower. Hey, man, I don't care if Scarlett Johansson is...
Other nights, it didn't come at all. Behind the cameras, exhaustion and anxiety followed him everywhere. When his time at SNL ended in 1993, the silence returned. Roles dried up, and money grew thin. But Chris refused to quit. He went back to small clubs, back to where it all began, performing for tiny crowds until his voice sharpened again. Then came Bring the Pain in 1996, and Bigger and Blacker in 1999. Two specials that didn't just make people laugh, they made them think. His comedy became bold, unfiltered, and brutally honest. He turned laughter into rebellion, and truth into art. The world finally applauded his rise. But even as the cheers grew louder, fame was beginning to take its toll, and the silence that once haunted his childhood would soon return in a much darker way. The father who built a fighter. Before the fame, before the spotlight and applause, there was Julius Rock, the man who quietly shaped Chris into who he would become. Julius was a man of few words but endless effort. He woke before sunrise every morning, delivering newspapers when the streets were still empty and cold. Then he spent long hours behind the wheel of his truck, hauling goods across New York until his hands were cracked and his clothes smelled of oil and sweat. He never complained, never slowed down. At home, Julius was the center of gravity. He taught his children discipline, pride, and survival. If you can stand, you can work. If you can breathe, you can fight, he used to say. Those words stayed with Chris long after childhood. Watching his father's daily grind made him understand what real strength looked like. Not fame, not applause, but showing up every single day, no matter how tired you were. Evenings in the Rock home were filled with small moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but later became priceless. Julius would come home exhausted, still manage a smile for his kids, and make a joke out of an empty wallet so they wouldn't worry. He made humor out of hardship, a skill that Chris unknowingly inherited. That was where the seed of comedy first took root, in the rhythm of survival, in the laughter that hid exhaustion. Then, one day in 1988, the man who had carried the family on his back was suddenly gone. Julius went in for what was supposed to be a simple surgery for an ulcer. Chris didn't worry at first. His father had survived harder things, but sometimes life changes in a heartbeat. The call came that Julius hadn't made it through. When Chris reached the hospital, he stood frozen by his father's bedside. The hands that had built his world were still. The man who had seemed invincible was gone. The silence in that room was heavier than anything he had ever known. For weeks, Chris couldn't speak about it. The pain sat in his chest like a stone. He had always turned to humor when life hurt, but this time, there were no jokes left. "When my dad died," he later said, "part of me died too, but the other part got louder." But grief, once awakened, rarely sleeps, and soon another tragedy would arrive, one that tested his soul in silence. addiction, fame, and the price of silence. By the time Chris Rock found fame, he had already buried his father and carried the weight of that loss in every laugh he told. But life, as it often does, was not done testing him. In 2006, he lost his half-brother Charles to alcoholism. Charles was older, proud, and private. He never asked for help, never complained, but the sadness in his eyes spoke louder than any words could. To the world, Charles was invisible. To Chris, he was family. They shared the same blood, the same toughness, the same quiet pride that kept emotions locked away. Charles drank not because he was weak, but because he didn't know how to express his pain. His silence became his prison, and by the time anyone realized how deep it went, it was too late. When the call came that Charles was gone, Chris felt the same stillness that had filled the hospital room years earlier when his father passed away. He didn't speak about it publicly. There were no interviews or statements. The pain was private, and the grief was quiet. But inside, something began to change. Chris understood now that silence could destroy a person. He once said, "Pain unspoken becomes poison." And those words became the truth he lived by. He started using his comedy not just to entertain, but to confess. Every joke became a way to release what others kept inside. Every laugh became an act of survival. That understanding wasn't new. It had started years earlier, in 1997, when he lost his close friend and fellow Saturday Night Live star, Chris Farley. Farley was a storm of laughter, energy, and heart. He could make a room explode with joy, yet behind the smiles, he was drowning. Addiction pulled him deeper until, one December morning, the laughter stopped. He was only 33. The loss shattered everyone who knew him. For Chris Rock, it was another painful reminder that comedy could not cure loneliness. He had seen Farley hide his pain behind jokes the same way he once did as a boy in Brooklyn. The lesson was cruel and clear. Laughter can save lives, but it cannot silence sorrow. In 2008, another blow came when Bernie Mac, his mentor and brother in comedy, passed away from pneumonia complications. Bernie was wisdom wrapped in humor, strength without arrogance. Losing him felt like losing history itself. And just when life seemed to steady again, a storm far more personal would break, one that not even laughter could save. The love that faded. In the middle of New York's chaos, when fame was starting to wrap its arms around him, Chris Rock met Malik Compton. She was everything his world wasn't. Calm, steady, and grounded. While Chris lived among bright lights and laughter, Malik worked in public relations, far from the noise of Hollywood. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that made him forget the noise for a while. Their connection was simple and real. It wasn't built on fame or spotlight. They would meet after long days, talk for hours, and find comfort in the quiet moments that fame rarely allowed. In 1996, they married in a private ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. No cameras, no reporters, just two people believing that love could outlast everything fame might take away. Their home in Alpine, New Jersey, became a safe space. Mornings began with coffee and laughter. Nights ended with warmth and stories. When their first daughter, Lola Simone, was born in 2002, Chris felt something change inside him. For the first time, the man who made the world laugh felt completely speechless. 2 years later, their second daughter, Zara Savannah, arrived, and life seemed complete. Chris became a devoted father. Sundays were for family walks in Central Park. No paparazzi, no performances, just a man pushing strollers and soaking in the peace of being anonymous. For a while, life was perfect. But perfection is fragile. The higher fame lifted him, the more it pulled him away from the people who loved him most. Malik remained patient, but silence can be louder than words. Their marriage didn't end in chaos. It faded in quiet exhaustion. Chris later admitted to infidelity, calling it his greatest regret. Fame had made him careless, and success had blinded him to what truly mattered. In therapy, he began to understand that his real weakness wasn't desire, it was avoidance. For years he had used humor to hide his emotions, turning pain into jokes instead of honesty. By 2016, their divorce was finalized after nearly 20 years of marriage. There were no public fights or cruel words. They chose grace over bitterness. Both focused on raising their daughters together, living only a few miles apart. Chris once said, "Being a father isn't about weekends, it's about showing up." And he did, quietly, consistently, and with love. While he worked to rebuild his peace in private, one night under Hollywood's brightest lights would thrust his deepest pain back into the world's view. The slap heard around the world. March 27, 2022 was the night that glittered with gold. The Dolby Theater in Hollywood was alive with applause, laughter, and flashing lights as the Academy Awards celebrated the brightest stars in film. Chris Rock stood on stage, confident and sharp, doing what he had done all his life, making people laugh. His jokes flowed easily, the crowd was with him, and the night seemed perfect. Then, in a split second, everything changed. Chris made a light-hearted remark about Jada Pinkett Smith, Will Smith's wife, comparing her shaved head to a movie character. The audience laughed, but within moments, the energy in the room shifted. Will Smith rose from his seat, his face set in anger, and walked toward the stage. At first, people thought it was part of the act. It wasn't. The sound of the slap echoed through the hall like thunder. The crowd gasped, frozen in disbelief.
Oh, wow! Wow! Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me.
Millions watching around the world sat in silence, unsure if what they had just seen was real. Chris stood still, his cheeks stinging, his mind racing. Every camera in the room focused on him. For a moment that seemed to last forever. The entire world watched him decide how to react. He did what he had done all his life. He stayed calm. Chris didn't curse or shout. He didn't strike back. Instead, he steadied his voice and managed a quiet, "Wow." It was the voice of a man who had faced pain before and knew the power of restraint. The show went on, but nothing felt the same. Behind the laughter and the glamour, a silence deeper than shame filled the room. In the days that followed, the world exploded with opinions. Headlines screamed, social media raged, and everyone had something to say, except Chris Rock. He refused interviews. He didn't post a word. His silence became louder than any speech. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. "You don't fight fire with fire," he would later say. "You wait until the smoke clears." And he did. A year later, in 2023, Chris returned to the stage with his Netflix special Selective Outrage. This time, he didn't hide behind jokes. He turned his humiliation into art. He spoke with honesty, not anger, transforming pain into something powerful. Both men later sought peace in their own ways. Will apologized. Chris moved forward. The incident became less about the slap and more about forgiveness. It was proof that dignity can survive even in the harshest light. Yet beyond fame, beyond forgiveness, Chris's greatest transformation was still ahead, a man learning to live, not just to perform. The man who survived the fire. At 60 years old, Chris Rock stands as a man who has lived through storms most people could not imagine. The poor boy from Brooklyn, who once swept floors and slept hungry, is now a legend whose name is written in the history of comedy. But beyond the awards and applause lies something far greater, a man who turned pain into purpose. Today, his life is quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos of fame. He lives in his New Jersey home, surrounded by calm and comfort. The man who once chased laughter now wakes up to silence and calls it peace. His net worth stands at around $60 million, a reflection of decades spent mastering his craft. Fatherhood has become the center of his world. Lola, now in her 20s, studies in Paris, while Zara continues her education in the United States, following in her mother's footsteps of helping others. Chris remains close to both. He calls them every night, visits whenever he can, and never lets fame come before family. "My daughters," he once said, "are the only standing ovations that still matter." His bond with them became even stronger after his diagnosis with nonverbal learning disorder in 2020. The condition affects how he interprets social cues and emotions. Instead of hiding it, he spoke about it openly, saying with humor, "I used to think I was bad at people. Turns out, I'm neurologically bad at people." It was his way of accepting himself with the same honesty he once used to face the world. Therapy, once a tool for healing, became a lifelong practice for self-awareness. In 2024, Chris returned to television with Everybody Still Hates Chris, a new animated version of the show that first told the story of his childhood. It was praised for its warmth, honesty, and heart. Through it, he reminded the world that even painful memories can be turned into stories that inspire. He often says, "You don't retire from truth, you just find new ways to tell it." Chris Rock's story is no longer about comedy. It's about endurance, forgiveness, and grace. He is living proof that even after walking through fire, a man can still rise with peace in his heart. What are your thoughts on Chris's life tragedies? Share in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.